Welcome to this explainer. Normally a 69-page constitutional court judgment is, well, it can be pretty dense. But today, we're unpacking a case from South Africa that is, at its absolute core, a deeply human story. We're going to explore how a seemingly mundane flaw in immigration law literally tore families apart, and how the Constitution ultimately had to step in to protect the very foundation of human dignity. So let's just jump right in with a fundamental question. Think about this for a second. Should a missing piece of paper or a delayed application literally force a husband and wife to live on entirely different continents? It sounds crazy, right? But this case forces us to look closely at that incredibly delicate balance between a government's legitimate need to control its borders and the everyday human lives that get caught in the crossfire of those controls. Now, to set the stage, it's fascinating to look at how international human rights law views this exact issue. Article 16 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights universally protects the family unit, literally calling it the natural and fundamental group unit of society. Basically, international law says families need to be protected, period. But as we're going to see, this beautiful international ideal was a world away from the harsh reality on the ground for three specific couples. Which brings us to part one: 3 marriages, 1 bureaucracy. Let's look at the real human toll here. Let's meet the people at the center of this: the Dawoods, the Shalabis, and the Thomases. We've got a watchmaker, a nurse, and a clerk. All South African citizens, all married to foreign nationals. Just completely ordinary folks, right? They just wanted to build their lives together in South Africa. But instead, they slammed right into a massive bureaucratic roadblock that was completely detached from their reality. Here's what that roadblock actually looked like. For the Dawoods, it was a sudden, totally unpayable fee of over 7,000 rand. I mean, for a watchmaker on a modest income, that's an impossible sum. And why? Just because a foreign police clearance was delayed. Then you have the Shalabis, literally handed a deportation order while holding their newborn son. And Mr. Thomas, he lost his job, so officials just outright refused to update his permit and told him to leave. Basically, a paperwork glitch meant a forced separation. So how did this even happen? That brings us to part 2, the legal catch-22. Let's look at the actual trap hidden inside the Aliens Control Act back then. The law essentially said, sure, as a foreign spouse, you can absolutely stay in South Africa while you wait for your permanent residency. But, and this is a massive but, only if you currently hold a valid temporary permit. The real kicker? The officials extending those temporary permits had absolutely zero legislative rules on why they might say yes or no. And it actually gets worse. Section 26(7) of the law made it a criminal offense to stay once that temporary permit expired. Think about that. You are legally married to a South African. Your permanent application is patiently pending in the system, but because your temporary paper expired, bam, you're a criminal in the eyes of the law, subject to arrest and deportation. The burden was entirely on the applicant's shoulders. This whole mess perfectly illustrates a concept called unfettered discretion. Because the law provided absolutely no guidelines, it left immigration officials with complete, unchecked power. It was like the Wild West. They could just refuse to extend a permit without any legal framework telling them what factors were appropriate to consider, like, oh, I don't know, the fact that you have a newborn baby or a South African spouse. It turned immigration into a bureaucratic lottery. Which leads us to part 3, the right to dignity. This is where a rigid rule meets a fundamental human right. When this finally reached the Constitutional Court, Justice O'Regan pointed out something really fascinating. The South African Constitution doesn't actually have a specific clause explicitly protecting family life. It's just not in there. So the court had to look elsewhere, leaning heavily on Section 10 of the Bill of Rights, the fundamental right to human dignity. And to define that dignity, the judgment grounded its analysis deeply in the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the idea that a person is a person because of other people. It's this beautiful recognition that we are inherently social creatures. Our humanity isn't just about us in isolation, it's expressed and realized through our relationships with others, most profoundly in our marriages and our families. Because of that deep connection, the court realized that human dignity inextricably includes the right to marry, to establish a family, and crucially, to actually live together. You can't just force a married couple to separate across borders and call it an administrative inconvenience. It's not. It is a direct, profound attack on their fundamental human dignity. And that brings us to part 4, the final verdict. Now, the court couldn't just say this is bad and walk away. They had to perform a strict constitutional test. They had to objectively weigh the government's totally legitimate need for border control against the devastating human impact of tearing these families apart. They were looking for a proportionate balance. And what they found was a glaring systemic flaw, that complete absence of guidelines for officials. Justice O'Regan really hit the nail on the head here. She stated that failing to identify criteria for these powers introduces an element of arbitrariness. Basically, yes, you can limit rights in certain extreme cases for border control, but leaving officials with completely unguided discretion, that's unconstitutional. It meant marriages were being destroyed not for good reasons, but for absolutely no stated reason at all. So the court's resolution was incredibly decisive. Immediately, they ordered release for the Dawoods, the Shalabis, and the Thomases. Their permits were finally granted. But they didn't stop there. They issued an interim protection for all other foreign spouses in the same boat, and then started a 24-month countdown clock. They basically gave Parliament a strict deadline to completely rewrite the unconstitutional law. And to make sure families were actually safe while Parliament did its work, the court created a good cause test. They explicitly directed immigration officials not to refuse temporary permits to foreign spouses pending their permanent residency decisions, unless they could establish good cause. Like what? Well, if the person was a real threat to the public, for example. That makes sense, right? It ensured nobody else would be arbitrarily deported just because a piece of paper expired while they were waiting in line. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. The Dawood case shows us just how devastating a single bureaucratic pen stroke can be, but also how powerful a constitution rooted in human dignity truly is. It really begs the question, can a government actually protect its borders without stripping away the fundamental dignity of the families crossing them? It's a delicate, absolutely critical balance between state bureaucracy and our shared humanity. Thanks for joining me today, and keep questioning the rules that shape our world.